Welcome. You've joined us for a deep dive into something truly fascinating. Marriage in ancient China.
Yeah.
We're going way back to the spring and autumn period that's roughly 771 to 476 BCE. And we've got some really incredible sources to unpack this with you.
That's right. We'll be exploring excerpts from poems from the state of Wei, which give us a really sort of intimate look at personal feelings, emotions,
Right.
and then we'll contrast those with narratives from the Zhou of Zhuan. That gives us the crucial historical context, outlining the societal norms of the time.
Okay, so our mission on this deep dive basically is to understand how the whole idea of marriage was changing back then.
Hmm.
We're really focusing on how these older ideas and, well, newer ideas about marriage were kind of living side by side and sometimes clashing pretty dramatically.
Especially within this one royal family, the state of Wei.
Exactly. You're going to hear about customs that might seem really different, maybe even strange compared to today, but honestly, at the heart of these stories are these very human dramas. You might
Hmm.
find them surprisingly relatable.
Definitely.
So let's just jump right in. Our first poem is Pao Yukuye. That translates roughly to "the gourd has bitter leaves."
Okay. So the poem, it opens with this really powerful image.
Yeah.
You've got a woman, she's waiting at a ford, a river crossing.
Okay.
And you can feel her anxiety. She's worried about the water level, presumably for her lover who's meant to be coming across.
Right. The poem actually says something like,
Yeah, the lines are something like, if the water is deep, tie the gourd around your waist and cross. If the water is shallow, lift up your clothes and wade through. You really get that sense of impatience.
okay, let's pause on that gourd image for just a second. Because we learned the gourd, the Pao, it actually had a pretty significant link to weddings back then.
It absolutely did. There was this specific ceremony, the Zhou ceremony, where the couple would split a gourd and drink wine from the two halves.
Ah, okay.
So yeah, for this woman to be mentioning a gourd, it almost certainly means marriage is on her mind.
That makes sense. It sets the scene for what she's hoping for.
Precisely. And the poem goes on, it adds these vivid details. The river's swelling, you hear pheasants calling, the sun's coming up. It all just heightens this feeling of anticipation.
Waiting, waiting.
Exactly. And then comes this very direct, almost urgent plea. If a young man wants to marry a wife, do it before the ice thaws.
Wow. So time is running out.
It really emphasizes that feeling, yeah. The fleeting nature of opportunity, maybe her own vulnerability in the situation.
Okay, that urgency feels important.
Uh-huh.
Now, here's where it gets, well, really interesting. The preface to this poem, it actually tells us who this woman is.
Right. She's identified as Jiang. She is apparently from a foreign ethnic group. Her surname was Jiang.
And her lover, the man she's waiting for.
None other than Duke Xuan of Wei, the ruler of the state.
The ruler himself. But hold on, there's a twist, isn't there? This isn't just a straightforward royal romance.
No, not at all. Here's the complication. Yi Jiang had been a concubine of Duke Xuan of Wei.
But Duke Xuan's father.
Exactly.
Yeah.
His father. So Yi Jiang was effectively Duke Xuan's stepmother.
Stepmother, okay. That immediately feels awkward or even wrong from our modern perspective.
It does. There's a bit of a parallel maybe with Wu Zixin in later Chinese history. She was Emperor Taizong's concubine, then married his son, Emperor Gaozong.
Ah, okay, I see the parallel. A step-parent becoming a spouse. It feels unusual today.
Very unusual for us.
Yeah.
And it shows that back then, the rules around family, marriage, propriety,
Yeah.
they could be more fluid, especially
Right.
when power and status were involved. It wasn't just a potential scandal like we'd see it. It reflects different social structures.
Right. So the big question then is, could he actually do that? Was it acceptable for Duke Xuan to marry his father's concubine in that society?
And this is where we see this fascinating clash, a real tension between older traditions and what were sort of newer emerging ideas about marriage.
Okay, tell us about that, the old versus the new.
Well, our sources point to this older concept called zeng. It's a term that seems to describe a relationship where, typically, a man of lower status forms a union with a woman of higher status.
Yeah.
But interestingly, zheng also had connections to ancestral sacrifices. In ancient China, ancestors weren't just memories. They were seen as active family members. Their approval was vital.
So like you had to get there okay.
Something like that. Some scholars think that if you formally reported a union like this one to the ancestors during the rituals, it was a way of seeking their blessing, maybe legitimizing it within the family structure, making it acceptable.
And this idea wasn't new even then.
No, not at all. We actually find mentions of this concept way back in the Shang dynasty, on oracle bone inscriptions.
Wow, okay. So those are the ancient writings on bones and shells for divination.
That's them. So this idea of Jiang had really deep historical roots.
So under this older way of thinking, maybe Duke Xuan marrying Jian wasn't completely out of bounds if it was, reported correctly.
Potentially, yes. That seems to be the argument for the older custom. But then you have the emerging concept.
Which is more like what we'd expect.
Exactly. It feels much more aligned with, let's say, traditional views as we might understand them. It emphasized ethics, morality. And under that framework, this marriage would be forbidden. Absolutely not okay.
And that must be why Yu Jian is so anxious in the poem.
Precisely. She's there at the river crossing, wondering which way Duke Xuan will go. Will he follow the older, more permissive custom, the Jiang idea? Or will this newer, stricter moral code win out?
Her plea to marry before the ice thaws sounds like she wants to lock it down before maybe those newer ideas gain too much ground.
That's a very plausible reading of her urgency, yes.
So what does the Zhou, the historical records, say happened? Did he marry her?
He did. Duke Xuan went ahead and married Yi Jiang. And they even had a son together named Ji.
GZ. And what happened to him?
He was actually made the crown prince. And
Yeah.
apparently he had the support of some powerful nobles.
Really? So that suggests that, at least initially, the marriage, or maybe just Duke Xuan's power, made it acceptable to the establishment.
It seems that way. It indicates that the older concept, or maybe just pragmatism in the face of the Duke's will,
Yeah.
carried the day. For a while, anyway.
Uh-oh. For a while sounds ominous.
Well, the story definitely doesn't end there. The narrative takes another unexpected turn when the crown prince, Ji, comes of age.
Okay, what happens?
An arranged marriage is planned for him. A very significant one, politically.
Right. I remember reading he was set to marry the sister of Duke Shang of Qi. Qi was a major state.
A very major state. And she was apparently incredibly beautiful. So, a good match on paper, politically advantageous.
But there's always a but in this story, isn't there?
It seems so. Another layer of, well, familial entanglement emerges. Duke Xuan, Ji's father,
Yeah.
took a liking to his son's bride-to-be.
No! Seriously, his own son's fiancé.
That's what the records say.
Okay, wait. We kind of understood the stepmother thing with the Zen concept, maybe, but how on earth could this be justified? A father taking his son's intended wife?
It really stretches our understanding of their norms, doesn't it?
Mm.
But again, we see this tension. Old versus new.
So what was the old justification this time?
Well, the argument, as some interpret it, rests on a very, very strong patriarchal view. The idea that sons, and maybe by extension their betrothed, were kind of under the father's authority. Almost like property, in a sense.
Wow, that's jarring. Patriarchal ownership allowing this.
It's a possible interpretation of how the older customs might have been twisted or understood by someone in power. But, of course, the emerging ethical principles, the newer ideas,
They would have condemned it outright.
almost certainly, seen as a major breach of family order, social norms, everything.
And Duke Xuan. Let me guess. He went with the older concept again.
Just like before. He married his son's intended bride. She then becomes known in the history books as Jian.
Jiang. Okay. You can just imagine the talk this must have caused in the state of Wei. The whispers.
Which leads us perfectly, actually, to the next poem, Xin Tai. That means the Xin Tai Terrace. It's from the Beifeng section of the Book of Songs.
The Book of Songs. That's the big collection of ancient Chinese poetry, right? Folk songs, court poems.
Exactly. A real window into how people felt back then. And this one, from the Beifeng, seems to capture public opinion in Wei pretty sharply at this point.
Okay, so set the scene. Duke Xuan, he's getting on in years by now, presumably.
He's older.
And he's just married this young, reportedly very beautiful woman, Shuan Jiang, who is meant for his son. It sounds like people weren't thrilled.
Not at all. The poem talks about this magnificent terrace, Xin Tai, probably built by the Duke to please Xuanjiang, right there by the river.
Sounds grand.
But then it just slams that splendor against the reality of the couple. The poem speaks of the woman wanting a handsome and gentle husband, but finding herself stuck with an ugly and repulsive old man.
Ouch. Doesn't mince words.
No. And there's this image of using a fishing net, maybe hoping for a good catch, but instead getting a wild goose, something unwanted, not what was expected. It really hits home this feeling of disappointment, a mismatch.
And it keeps repeating the criticism.
Yes, the lament about the deformed and unpleasant man comes up again. It leaves very little doubt about the public's view of this marriage.
It sounds like more than just disapproval of the age gap. Is it maybe hinting at, changing ideas about what marriage should even be? Not just politics, but maybe some affection or respect.
That's a really interesting layer to consider. It could well reflect shifting expectations alongside the obvious disapproval.
So Shintai is like the ancient version of a critical op-ed, expressing the people's unhappiness with this ethically dubious relationship.
Pretty much, yeah. And the story, unfortunately, continues its tragic path.
What happened next?
Jiang, the new wife, became the favorite. She had two sons with Duke Xuan, named Shu and Shuo.
Okay, and what about Jiang, the first wife, the mother of the crown prince?
Jiang, the woman from the first poem, waiting so anxiously at the ford. She was heartbroken, completely sidelined, replaced. And the sources say, tragically, she eventually hanged herself.
Oh, that's awful. Just devastating. It really drives home the human cost of all this political maneuvering and shifting norms.
It really does.
And Crown Prince GZ, how did he handle this? I mean, his fiancée was now his stepmother. His original mother was gone. That's just unbelievably complicated and painful.
It is. Yet according to the Zhuan, GZ showed remarkable filial piety. He actually accepted Jiang as his mother.
Really?
Yes, and he treated her sons, Shou and Shuo, as his proper brothers. Despite the incredibly strange, painful situation, he upheld his expected role.
That says so much about the pressure of filial duty back then. But it sounds like Duke Xuan couldn't just let things be. Maybe guilt was eating at him.
It seems plausible. The record says he grew increasingly unhappy with GZ, his eldest son. Maybe GZ was a constant reminder of his own questionable choices.
And this unhappiness led to...
It escalated.
Yeah.
Tragically, Duke Xuan hatched a plot to get rid of GZ, to assassinate him.
Oh, no.
He sent GZ on an official mission, supposedly to the state of Qi. But secretly, he arranged for bandits to ambush and kill him on the border.
That's incredibly dark. His own son. Did the plan work? Did anyone know?
Well, it didn't go entirely unnoticed. Gongzi Shuai. That's Jiang's older son, GZ's half-brother.
The one who technically stood to gain if GZ was out of the way.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But Shou actually loved and respected GZ deeply. He somehow found out about his father's treacherous plan.
And what did he do?
He rushed to warn GZ. He begged him, "Don't go, flee, save yourself." He tried to get him to avoid the ambush.
So GZ knew. What was his reaction? Did he escape?
Sadly, no. GZ seems to have been almost fatalistic about it. Bound by that incredibly strong code of filial obedience, he apparently said he couldn't disobey his father's direct command. Running away would be cowardly, wrong.
Wow, tragic honor. So Shou warned him, but GZ refused to flee. What did Shu do then?
What Shu did next is quite extraordinary, an incredible act of loyalty, really. He got GZ drunk.
And drunk.
So GZ would be incapacitated. Then Shou, pretending it was all part of the mission escort, went to the border himself, in GZ's place, to meet the supposed delegation. He knew he was walking into a death trap.
He took his brother's place, knowing he'd be killed.
He sacrificed himself for his brother. It's an amazing display of love and loyalty in this brutal context.
Unbelievable, but the tragedy wasn't over, was it?
No. When GZ finally sobered up, realized what Shou had done, the immense sacrifice, he was overcome with grief, maybe guilt. He felt responsible.
So what did he do?
He immediately rode to the border himself, apparently hoping he could explain the mistake to the bandits, tell them they'd killed the wrong person.
Oh, GZ.
But the bandits, they were just following Duke Xuan's orders. Explicit orders. They showed no mercy. They killed GZ too.
Both of them. Both brothers died.
Both dead. Killed because of their father's plot. It's just devastating. It really highlights a terrible human cost when these power games clash with morality or what's left of it.
There must have been immense grief and Wei over this.
Absolutely. And there's another poem, Cheng Zhu. It means the two sons took a boat. It seems to be a lament for the two brothers.
What's the feeling in that poem?
It uses this really evocative image. A small boat carrying the brothers, perhaps metaphorically, just drifting further and further away on the water. It expresses this deep sense of loss, a longing for them. The lines repeat, saying how much they're missed, hoping they won't come to harm. It powerfully captures that public sorrow.
What a cascade of tragedy. Just one terrible decision after another. So Duke Xuan eventually dies. What happens then?
Well, Gongzi Shuo, remember him? Xuanjiang's younger son.
Right. Shou's brother.
He's the one who ends up taking the throne. He becomes Duke of Wei.
Duke Wei. But I imagine the people weren't exactly cheering for him, given how his brothers died.
Exactly. The people of Wei deeply mourned Shizi and Shou. They likely knew, or at least suspected,
Yeah.
the shady circumstances. So yeah, they had very little love or respect for Duke Wei.
And in the spring and autumn period, if you didn't have support, especially from the nobles, your position was shaky, right?
Extremely shaky. You needed that backing.
Yeah.
Without it, Duke He's rule was really precarious. And sure enough, after only about 3 years,
He was kicked out.
driven away, he had to flee away, and ran to his mother's home state, Qi, for protection. Took refuge with his uncle, Duke Shang.
Ah, Duke Xuan of Qi, Xuanzhang's brother. So the uncle steps in.
He does. Partly maybe out of family concern for his nephew, but also, politics, an opportunity to exert more influence over Wei. So he sends an army to put Duke He back on the throne.
Okay, so he helps his nephew. But there was a catch, wasn't there? Another really unconventional marriage involved.
There was the infamous Zhang Yu Xuanzhang.
Okay, break that down for us. What happened?
So Duke Shang of Qi, likely to shore up his nephew Duke He's weak position and tie Wei closer to Qi, he engineers another marriage. He arranges for Gongzi Wan.
Who's Gongzi Wan?
Gongzi Wan was another half-brother to Duke Hui, a son of Duke Xuan, but by a different concubine.
Okay, so Duke He's half-brother. And who does Duke Shang want him to marry?
Xuanzhang.
Wait, Xuanzhang, Duke Hui's mother, and Duke Ying's own sister.
Yes, mother, sister, stepmother to Gongzi Wan. It's incredibly tangled. This was the second time Xuanzhang was involved in a Zhang relationship, marrying a man of technically lower status
Yeah.
within the immediate family hierarchy, her stepson in this case.
I can barely keep track of the relationships. Gongzi Wan. Xuanzhang was originally meant to be his sister-in-law when she was engaged to Jizi.
Correct.
Then she became his stepmother when his father married her.
Also correct.
And now she's his wife. How did they even function as a family? The awkwardness must have been off the charts.
It's almost possible for us to imagine, isn't it?
Yeah.
The sources do say Gongzi Wan was initially very reluctant. He objected.
I should hope so.
But Duke Jiang of Qi was powerful. The pressure was immense. Eventually, Gongzi Wan complied.
And they actually had a family.
They did. Remarkably, despite how scandalous it seems to us, Gongzi Wan and Xuanzhang had 3 sons and 2 daughters together.
Wow. The people of Wei. They must have been talking about this too. This couldn't have gone unnoticed.
Oh, absolutely. And their feelings seem to surface in yet another poem from the Book of Songs. This one is Can You See? There are thistles on the wall, from the Young Fing section.
Thistles on the wall.
Yeah.
Like something prickly, unwanted, hard to get rid of.
Exactly, that kind of feeling. The poem talks about thistles that cannot be swept away, cannot be removed, something persistent, maybe irritating, impossible to ignore.
Okay.
And then it speaks about words concerning the inner chambers, the private affairs of the palace, saying these things should not be spoken of. Why? Because detailing them, repeating them, would be too shameful, or just a long and disgraceful story.
So it's like we shouldn't talk about this, but everyone knows and it's bad.
That's definitely one strong interpretation. It applies widespread awareness and a sense of shame or scandal about these, incestuous relationships within the ruling family. Given the disapproval we saw earlier, it seems very likely people were aware and probably scandalized.
Does the source suggest any other way to read those lines?
Well, it does mention a possibility, maybe less likely, but possible, that it's not genuine discretion, but more of a gossipy nudge, like saying, we mustn't talk about it, precisely to make people more curious.
The ancient equivalent of no comment, but.
Something like that. Either way, though, it clearly points to public awareness and most likely disapproval of these very irregular unions.
Okay. And finally, there's one more poem, Junzi Shi Lao, May the Gentleman and the Lady Grow Old Together. This one seems to focus a lot on Xuanzhang herself, particularly her beauty.
It really does. The poem goes into extraordinary detail describing her appearance. We hear about her elaborate hairpins, her elegant clothes, her posture and grace being compared to mountains and rivers.
Wow, high praise.
Oh, yes. Exquisite embroidered robes, dark glossy hair, jade earrings, ivory hairpins, a fair complexion. She's even compared to celestial beings. The description is incredibly ornate, really emphasizing exceptional physical beauty.
It sounds like she was considered a legendary beauty. I think you mentioned the phrase Bangzi Yuanye comes from this context, meaning the most beautiful woman in the state.
That's right. It's a phrase signifying supreme beauty. And yes, interestingly, it's the origin of the name for the modern writer, Qi Bengwan.
Fascinating connection. Now, how has this poem usually been interpreted, given Xuanzhang's complicated history?
Well, the traditional reading often contrasts this stunning outward beauty with her supposed inner corrupt morals. seeing her role in these scandalous marriages as proof of her flawed character. It plays into that old, almost archetypal idea of the beautiful woman as a source of trouble, a scourge.
The femme fatale trope again?
Kind of, yes. But the source material we looked at also proposes a different, perhaps more nuanced interpretation, and honestly one I find quite compelling.
What's the alternative view?
It suggests maybe the poem isn't condemning her at all. Maybe it's actually a lament for the tragic fate of this incredibly beautiful woman who got caught up in these unbelievably complex, destructive situations.
So maybe the focus shouldn't be on her morals, but on the circumstances created by others, like Duke Xuan, and the society itself.
Exactly. Perhaps the fault lies more with Duke Xuan's actions and with those older customs, the Zheng concept, that provided some kind of framework, however shaky, for these unions. It forces us to consider the context, the clash between old and new values again.
That's a really important distinction. It shifts the focus from just blaming the woman to looking at the whole system, the societal pressures, the political forces, like the power of Qi.
Right. We can't forget the influence of the state of Qi in propping up these later arrangements. Their political might likely played a big role in why things were tolerated, at least on the surface.
And despite everything, her children, from the marriage to Gongziwan, her stepson, they weren't necessarily shunned.
It seems not, which is another fascinating layer. Two of their sons actually went on to rule Wei later on. Yes. And their daughters also made significant marriages. One married the ruler of Duke Xuan of Qi, was apparently even a suitor for her at one point. The other married the ruler of Song and became the mother of Duke Xuan of Song.
Duke Xuan of Song, wasn't he one of the 5 hegemons, one of the most powerful rulers of the era?
The very same. So her descendants were major players. It just underlines how complex the interplay of power, politics, family ties, and shifting social rules was back then.
What an incredibly tangled, dramatic story. It really paints a picture of a society so different from ours, but wrestling with themes, power, desire, morality, family that still feel very real.
Absolutely. And I think as we've explored in this deep dive, the key takeaway is that the spring and autumn period was this pivotal moment of change for marriage concepts. You had older customs like Jiang, allowing things that newer emerging moral standards were starting to see as deeply unethical.
And the state of Wei's royal family drama just vividly illustrates that clash. Jiang, Shuan, their lives were right at the center of it.
Exactly.
It really makes you, the listener, think about how norms around something as basic as marriage have kept changing throughout history right up to today. And how personal desires, ambitions, love, maybe, how they intersect with what society expects or allows, sometimes, as we saw here, with really dramatic, even tragic results.
It leaves us with a pretty provocative thought, doesn't it? Thinking about all this tragedy in Wei, was it mainly down to individuals like Duke Xuan breaking what were becoming the accepted moral rules?
Or was it more that the society itself was kind of stuck, still holding on to older customs that just didn't fit anymore, creating these impossible situations for people like Jiang and Jian?
Yeah, where does the responsibility lie? With the individuals or the system they were in? And what does this whole story tell you, listening now, about why having clear, widely accepted social norms might actually be important for any society?
Definitely some big questions to mull over. And clearly, from what we've touched on, there are so many more layers in the Zhuan and other texts about values and lives in ancient China.
Oh, absolutely. This is just scratching the surface.
Well, it's an invitation for you to explore further.
Hey, you. Ever find yourself wondering, not just about the big historical events, but the personal stories?
Yeah, the everyday stuff.
Exactly. Like, we read about dynasties, but what about real human moments? Have you ever imagined what a wedding might have been like, say, thousands of years ago?
It's fascinating to think about.
Well, we've been doing some digging into the Zhou dynasty that's way back, roughly 1046 to 256 BCE.
A long time ago, yeah.
And we've been using this amazing collection of poems, the Two Souths, from the Book of Songs, and also looking at classical texts on rituals.
Right, comparing the poetry with the rule books, essentially.
Pretty much. So our mission today, just for you, is to pull out the most insightful, maybe even surprising, bits about Zhou dynasty weddings.
And what's really interesting, I think, is the combination of sources. The Two Souths, this part of the Book of Songs, it gives us this really quite intimate glimpse.
Into whose lives, exactly?
Well, it seems to be the common nobility, so we're not talking emperors, definitely not, but probably not the, the average farmer either.
Okay, so sort of middle upper class for the time.
Kind of, yeah.
Right.
Think maybe scholars, minor officials, the The poems themselves hint at this. They mention things like lutes and zithers.
Instruments, okay.
Right, instruments for leisure, and also bells, bronze wine vessels, even rhinoceros horn cups, and importantly, carriages.
Ah, carriages. That definitely suggests a certain status.
Exactly. These aren't everyday items for just anyone. They paint a picture of, well, a certain level of comfort and social standing.
It really helps ground it, doesn't it? And like you said, to get the full picture, we're pairing this with the Confucian classics on rites.
Texts like the Book of Rites of Zhou, the Book of Etiquette, the Book of Rites, these basically lay out the ideal way things should be done, the ceremonies, the behavior.
So by putting the poems next to these ritual texts, we can start to see maybe where the rules met reality or didn't.
Precisely. That's the goal, to see where the ideal and the actual lined up, or, where they diverged.
So this deep dive, we're looking at the key parts of a Zhou wedding.
Yeah, exploring the formal rituals, those carefully prescribed steps, but also those more spontaneous feelings about love and marriage that pop up in the poems.
Like comparing the official guidebook to someone's personal photos from back then.
That's a great way to put it, yeah.
Okay, so let's start with the formal stuff. The Book of Etiquette lays out the wedding ceremony of a scholar. 6 steps, right?
That's the one. 6 key procedures.
And the first is na kai, gift of selection. What did that involve?
Well, what's really interesting is the word kai itself. So the man, usually through a matchmaker, gives gifts, the kai lai, to the woman's family.
Okay, standard enough.
But kai here, it's not about color or decoration. It's the same word as in don't pick the roadside flowers. It means selection.
Ah, so he's selecting her.
Right. But it also carries this sense of maybe the woman's humility. Like she's available to be picked. It's a bit surprising to our modern ears, maybe.
Wow. Yeah, that adds a layer. So even from step 1, there's this dynamic of his action and her, well, expected modesty.
Exactly. It seems to run through a lot of these rituals.
Okay, so after this gift of selection, what's next?
Next up is Wenming. Pretty straightforward. Inquiring about the name.
Just asking her name.
Her name, and crucially, her birth date. And that wasn't just, small talk.
Right, because that leads into step 3, na ji, divination.
Precisely. They needed that birth info to see if the match was, well, cosmically compatible, auspicious.
So they had actually consult fortune tellers or something.
Yes, diviners,
Ah.
to see if the pairing was good. And we actually see this in the poems. Wei Fing Meng has that line, "You divined and you augured, and there was no inauspicious omen."
Huh. So it really was a serious step.
Absolutely, making sure the union was harmonious.
Okay, so the stars align, divination is good. What then? Wedding bells.
Not quite yet. Step 4 is Najiang. This is the formal engagement.
Na zheng. What does zheng mean?
It means something like accomplishment or completion. So this was the point it became official. The betrothal was locked in.
Okay, formally engaged. 2 steps left.
Yep. Then comes Qingqi, requesting the date.
Ah, logistics time.
Exactly. The man gives more gifts, and they figure out the actual wedding date. Things get practical.
And the final step.
Qinying, picking up the bride. This is when the groom himself goes to her home to bring her back to his place.
The grand finale of the procedures.
You could say that, yeah. The end of the formal sequence.
It all sounds very structured, very formal.
It is on paper.
But, like we said, the poems might show a different side. Let's think about the woman's role. These 6 steps make her seem pretty passive, don't they?
That's a really key point. The formal rites, yes, very passive seeming, but the poetry, often quite different.
How so?
We see women expressing their own desires, sometimes even initiating things. The poem Baiyao Yu Mei, The Falling Plums, is a fantastic example.
Oh, I remember that one. With the plums falling off the tree. How does that show female agency?
Okay, so the first stanza, she sings something like, "Plums are falling, still 7/10 left. Young men who want me, hurry, pick a good day."
So she's aware time's ticking, maybe a bit anxious, but still kind of reserved.
Exactly. Putting it out there, but gently. But then stanza 2.
It changes.
Yeah, the tone shifts. Plums are falling, only 3/10 left. Young men who want me, today's the day.
Okay, definitely more urgent now. The window's closing.
Right. And that last stanza,
That one felt really direct.
totally. Plums are falling, filling the basket. Young men who want me, just say the word.
Wow. All pretense gone. Just ask me already.
Exactly. It shows this progression, her growing eagerness, and her willingness to be much more forward than the rituals suggest. It really challenges that stereotype of the always demure, passive woman.
That contrast is fascinating. It makes me think of that saying, when the rights are lost, seek them among the common people. What's that about here?
It suggests that, sometimes the official rules don't capture the real feelings or experiences of ordinary people.
So maybe among this nobility class, people were a bit less buttoned up about marriage than the strict ceremonies implied.
That's the idea. It hints at a potentially less reserved attitude, which might be surprising given our usual image of ancient China. It wasn't always rigid formality in personal life.
That's a really key takeaway. Okay, so we've looked at the woman's perspective. What about the man's proposal? The formal rites mentioned a specific gift, didn't they? Something unusual.
Yes, the wedding ceremony of a scholar says the symbolic gift was a wild goose.
A wild goose. Why a goose?
Well, the idea was that geese are migratory. They fly south for winter, north for spring. This back and forth was seen as reflecting yin and yang.
The cosmic balance thing again.
Right. And since marriage was also seen as a union of yin and yang, the goose symbolized that harmony following natural patterns.
Very symbolic. But do wild geese pop up all over the Book of Songs as engagement gifts?
Well, wild geese are in the poems, but interestingly, not really mentioned as betrothal gifts. What the poems do talk about again and again as something crucial for a man to get ready for a wedding is firewood.
Firewood.
Right.
Seriously, how does firewood link to proposing?
Okay, think about it. Zhou dynasty weddings were traditionally held at dusk.
Right, getting dark.
Exactly. So you'd need a lot of firewood for torches to light the whole thing. Cutting and gathering firewood became this really important, almost preliminary step before the formal proposal.
Huh. That's practical. A demonstration he can provide for the event.
Precisely. A very tangible sign of commitment.
Do the poems actually show this?
Absolutely. Han Guang is a great example. The poet can't get to the girl he likes across the river, so what does he do?
Right.
He focuses on the forest nearby. The luxuriant and scattered firewood, I will cut the thorns. And then he links it directly to her getting married. When that girl gets married, I will feed her horses.
So cutting firewood is his way of acknowledging her wedding, even if it's not to him.
It seems like it. Even in unrequited love, the focus goes to this practical wedding prep.
Are there others? Poems linking firewood and marriage.
Oh, yeah. Qifeng Nan Shan talks about needing an axe to shape an axe handle, like needing a matchmaker to marry, linking woodworking and marriage arrangement.
Okay, the metaphor.
And Binfeng Heifai does something similar. But maybe the most direct is Tongfeng Chao Mu. It uses the act of tightly binding firewood bundles, Chao Mu, as a symbol for the strong bond of marriage.
Binding bundles, binding the couple.
Exactly. And Chao Mu itself came to mean a loving relationship.
So it seems like the formal rite was the symbolic goose, but the poems show the reality was more about the practical firewood.
That's what it looks like. A great peek into how big life events were tied to everyday needs.
Okay, let's move to the bride's arrival. Her journey to the groom's home. Social status mattered here, right? How she traveled.
Big time. For a bride from the scholar class, let's say, the groom usually fetched her himself in a carriage. Wei Feng Imeng mentions this. With your carriage coming, I will move my dowry.
A personal pickup.
Yeah, but for higher-ranking families. Ministers, royalty, very different.
How so?
The bride would arrive in her own family's carriage, often with a huge procession. The poems Keqiao and Hebi Nongyi really show this off.
Can you give us a sense of that? What did it look like?
Keqiao describes the bride arriving with 100 carriages escorting her. 100. It just screams status and the power of her family.
Wow, 100 carriages. That's a statement.
Definitely. And Hiba Nongyi focuses on a princess's carriage, calling it solemn and harmonious, and stressing her amazing lineage, granddaughter of a king, daughter of a marquis. Her transport itself broadcasts her family's importance.
So why use her own family's carriage? Is showing off wealth.
The source suggests it was also seen as, surprisingly, a sign of her family's humility.
Humility. Yeah.
The idea was, well, maybe they hadn't educated her perfectly. And there was this underlying implied possibility that the husband's family might not be happy, might even send her back.
Really?
Yeah. So arriving in her own carriage meant she technically had a way to leave if things went badly. It probably wasn't common, but the option was symbolically there.
So it's a status symbol, but also a subtle hint that she could leave if not treated right. That's fascinating.
Exactly. It communicated her worth and, potential consequences.
A real power dynamic hidden in the ceremony. And after the wedding, was she immediately part of the new family for good?
Well, the marriage was set, but the full integration was marked later by a ritual called Fan Ma Jili.
The rite of returning the horses.
That's it. About 3 months later, the groom would send the horses that pulled her carriage back to his mother-in-law.
Signifying what?
That their daughter was now permanently part of his family. She wasn't going back. The carriage might stay, but without horses. It stuck.
Like symbolically taking the engine out of her car.
A very modern way to put it, but yeah, same idea.
Okay, let's switch gears. Music. You'd think weddings would have music, right? Celebration?
You would think. But here, the sources seem to disagree again. It's really interesting.
What's the conflict?
The Confucian classics, like the Book of Rites, actually say there should be no music at weddings.
No music. At a wedding? That sounds kind of bleak. Why?
The main reason goes back to yin and yang. The ceremony itself was yin feminine still. Music was yang masculine, active.
And playing music would mess up the balance.
That was the thinking, yeah. It would disrupt the natural order. Plus, there was this other idea that the groom should be a bit solemn.
Solemn? Why?
Because his new wife would eventually become the mistress of the house, potentially changing things for his own mother. So a certain gravity was expected, another reason cited for no music.
Huh. Specific philosophical reasons.
Yeah.
But then, poems like Guanju, that ends with bells and drums we delight her. Sounds like music to me.
Exactly. And that's the debate. Some scholars use the no music rule to argue Guanju can't be a wedding poem.
But is that the only view?
No, and I think the more compelling argument is that such a strict rule probably wasn't followed everywhere by everyone.
Right, maybe it was an ideal, or for specific groups or times.
Quite possibly. It seems more likely that many people did have music. The very fact that we have poems in the Book of Songs that sound like wedding music strongly suggests it happened.
Yeah, people naturally want to celebrate, right?
You'd think so. These rule books often show the ideal, not always the messy reality.
So absence in the rules doesn't mean absence in real life. Good point.
Definitely underscores why we need to look at different kinds of evidence.
You mentioned one poem seemed especially like a wedding song. To wrap up, let's look at that one. Taiyao.
Yes, Taiyao. The peach tree is in full bloom. It's just beautiful, so optimistic, really feels perfect for a wedding.
Okay, break it down for us. What's the symbolism in the 3 stanzas?
Sure. Stanza 1. The peach tree is in full bloom, its flowers bright and beautiful. When that girl gets married, she will fit well in her husband's family.
So the blossoms are like the beauty and good start of the marriage.
Yeah.
And fitting in.
Exactly. Freshness, beauty, auspicious beginnings, and that hope for harmony for her integrating smoothly into the new family.
Lovely image. Stanza 2.
The peach tree is in full bloom. It bears abundant fruits. When that girl gets married, she will fit well in her husband's home.
Fruits. That seems obvious. Fertility.
Yep. Fertility, abundance, prosperity, lots of kids, all those hopes for the new couple. And fitting in the home expands it to the whole household life.
Makes sense. And the final stanza.
The peach tree is in full bloom. Its leaves are lush and green. When that girl gets married, she will get along well with her husband's family.
Leaves, life, growth.
Vitality, longevity.
Yeah.
And the hope for good, lasting relationships with the in-laws. Getting along well with the whole extended family, which was and still is pretty important.
It really is a lovely poem, full of positive vibes for the couple. Definitely sounds like wedding material, rules or no rules.
Absolutely. It captures those core wishes, harmony, prosperity, strong family ties.
So, bringing our deep dive to a close, what are the big takeaways from looking at Zhou weddings through these sources? What really stands out?
For me, definitely the surprising agency women could show, like in Falling Plums, despite the formal rituals.
Oh, that contrast.
And the sheer practical importance of firewood. It really grounds the whole thing.
Yeah, the goose versus firewood thing was great.
Also, how status was shown through transport. Those carriages tell a story. And of course, the whole music debate highlighting that gap between ideal rules and likely reality.
Those are great points. It paints a much richer, more, human picture than just dates and procedures.
Exactly.
So,
looking at both the rules and the poetry gives us a much more nuanced view of their lives.
So for everyone listening, thinking about these ancient ways, the mix of ritual and, real personal feelings, it makes you wonder, doesn't it? What parts of our modern weddings, with all our traditions and trends, will people look back on in the future and find just as curious or revealing about us? Definitely something to think about, those enduring human threads of love and marriage across time.
We're taking a look at divorce in ancient China.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, but specifically the Spring and Autumn period and the Ming and Qing dynasties.
Wow, okay.
Yeah, and you might think that divorce back then was like, a really uncommon thing, like we think of today.
Right, right.
But actually, during the Spring and Autumn period, it was incredibly common, but not always for the reasons you might think. It wasn't always about, personal feelings. It was more about politics and maneuvering and strategy.
Wow.
Yeah, so for example, we have Lady Cai.
Okay.
And she was actually remarried off without a formal divorce to kind of send a message.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it was the state of Cai sending a political message to Duke Xuan of Qi. And so that's really different from what we see later on, like in the Ming and Qing dynasties, where divorce was like this major social taboo.
I see, yeah.
Even for the elite.
Oh, wow.
So we're going to be looking at stories of noble women who are like caught up in these political power plays, as well as the struggles of like ordinary people. Yeah. And even a woman who stood up for herself in this like really heartbreaking situation.
Wow, that's quite a range of stories from ancient China.
Yeah.
I'm excited.
So let's dive into the Spring and Autumn period first.
Okay.
It was a time when marriage was really seen as the strategic alliance between two families.
Yeah.
And some texts even refer to it as like forging a good relationship between two surnames.
Oh, wow.
So what can you tell us about how divorce played into all of this?
Well, during this period, divorce was more about kind of severing those political ties.
Yeah.
Rather than like focusing on personal feelings.
Right.
Lady Cai's story is a perfect example of that.
Okay.
Her husband, Duke Xuan of Ti, decided to go to war with the state of Chu. So he sent her back to her home state without a formal divorce.
Wow.
But it doesn't even end there.
Oh.
The state of Cai then remarried her off.
Oh my gosh.
Again, without a formal divorce, as like a deliberate message to Duke Xuan.
That seems almost passive aggressive.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It was a very public way of showing Duke Xuan that they weren't on his side anymore.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, their allegiance now was with Chu.
Wow.
This kind of, political maneuvering, it was pretty common back then.
Yeah.
Another fascinating story is that of Lady Huai.
Okay, and how did she get wrapped up in all of this?
Well, she was first married off to a hostage prince, the future Duke Huai of Jian.
Okay.
And it was a way to kind of establish a bond between the two states.
Right.
But Duke Huai escaped.
Oh, no.
Yeah, he escaped back to his home state, leaving Lady Huai behind, again, without a formal divorce.
So what happened to her?
Well, so to complicate things even further, she was then married off to Duke Huai's uncle.
Oh, wow.
Who later became Duke Wen of Jian, which is the same man who had taken her in as a hostage.
That's a crazy story.
It is, and reactions to this remarriage were very mixed.
Okay.
Some people saw Lady Huai as like double favored by destiny.
Oh, wow.
But other people criticized it as licentiousness.
Wow, that's so interesting how one situation could be viewed in two completely different ways.
Yeah, it really highlights how social values were kind of changing at this time. And this leads us to another story, the story of Shengbo's sister.
Okay.
Who was also caught up in all of these political marriages.
Right.
But her story, as we'll discuss later, has a much more tragic ending.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
So it sounds like there's a lot more to uncover here.
Yeah.
But before we move on, is there anything else about the Spring and Autumn period that really stands out to you about divorce?
Yeah, I think it's important to remember that while these stories are really interesting and tell us a lot about the elite, they don't really represent everyone.
Right.
For ordinary people, marriage and divorce were likely influenced by other things.
Yeah.
Probably less about political strategy.
Right.
And more about like economic necessity or personal circumstances.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So it's important to keep that in mind as we, keep learning about this period.
For sure.
Yeah.
Okay, so now let's fast forward a bit.
Okay.
To the Ming and Qing dynasties.
Right.
And see how things changed when it comes to divorce. It's interesting because what was once this, like, strategic political tool became a huge social taboo.
Wow.
Especially among the elite.
Yeah.
So what do you think caused that shift?
Well, during the Ming and Qing dynasties, Confucian values really took hold.
Okay.
And they put a huge emphasis on family harmony.
Okay. Yeah.
And so because of that, divorce was seen as like this disruption of this harmony.
Right.
And it could really damage a man's reputation.
Wow, so it was really looked down upon.
Yeah, and there's this really interesting quote from Fang Bao, who was a scholar from that era.
Okay.
And he basically complained that men couldn't divorce their wives, even if they were really unhappy in their marriage.
That seems kind of counterintuitive.
Yeah, it really does.
You would think that a society that's so focused on harmony would want people to be able to leave relationships that weren't working.
You would think so, but actually this taboo probably had some unintended consequences.
Oh, like what?
Well, by making it so hard to legally separate, men started taking concubines as a way to, seek companionship and fulfillment outside of their marriage if they were unhappy.
So basically, trying to force this image of a harmonious family
Right.
might have actually led to more suffering.
Yeah, especially for the wives.
Right. It's important to remember, though, that this pressure to maintain appearances
Yeah,
really only applied to the elite.
exactly.
So what about everyone else? What was divorce like for ordinary people?
Well, for the lower classes, economic hardship was a huge factor.
Yeah.
Much more than social stigma.
Right.
And so there are a lot of records that show men actually selling their wives because of poverty.
Wow.
It wasn't about reputation or social standing at all.
Right.
It was just about survival.
Wow. That's heartbreaking.
It is. It really shows how the pressures and constraints around divorce were very different for different social classes.
Definitely. And there's actually a great example of this in the classic Chinese novel Water Margin.
Oh, yeah.
One of the main characters, Lin Chang,
Okay.
he's falsely accused of a crime.
Oh, no.
And to protect his wife, he writes her a letter of divorce
Oh, wow.
so she can remarry.
Hmm.
And knowing the context of divorce during that time,
Yeah,
it really adds another layer to his actions.
for sure.
It wasn't that he wanted to divorce her. It
Yeah.
was that he was trying to keep her safe.
Yeah,
Because the system wasn't really set up to help them.
exactly. It shows the really difficult choices people had to make back then.
Yeah.
For the elite, it was all about reputation.
Yeah.
But for the poor, it was about life and death.
So we're seeing this really complex relationship with divorce,
Right.
influenced by social expectations, economics, and even gender.
Absolutely.
And this leads to a question, did women have any say in all of this?
That's a great question.
Yeah. Could they initiate divorce?
It seems like in earlier periods, like the Spring and Autumn period, and even the Western Han Dynasty,
Okay.
women did have some agency
Okay.
when it came to initiating divorce.
Mhm.
But as we move into the Ming and Qing dynasties, things change,
So things got more restrictive.
unfortunately.
Yeah.
By the Ming and Qing dynasties, it was really hard for women to initiate divorce, both because of social expectations and the legal systems in place at the time.
But were there any exceptions?
There was one.
Oh.
It was a legal concept called yiju.
Oh, okay. And what is that exactly?
Basically, it means that the relationship has completely broken down.
Okay.
And in those cases, divorce was allowed,
Mm.
even if it was the woman who requested it.
So even though the system wasn't really fair to women,
Right.
there was at least some recognition that certain things were so bad that they
Yes.
justified ending a marriage,
Exactly.
even if the woman asked for it.
Yeah, and to see how this played out in a real situation,
Okay.
let's go back to the story of Shengbo's sister.
All right.
It's a really powerful reminder that behind all of these big societal changes and legal frameworks,
Yeah.
there were real people
Right.
dealing with really tough choices.
Okay. So Shengbo's sister.
Yeah, so she's a really sad example of how women, even those from like powerful families,
Yeah.
could be used as pawns
Yeah.
in these political games.
Right.
You know, like we talked about earlier, Shengbo, he saw a chance to improve his own position.
Yeah.
And so he decided to marry his half-sister
Mm.
to a powerful noble from the state of Jian.
Wow.
And this was actually her second marriage.
Oh, wow.
She had been widowed before this.
I can't believe he would use his own sister like that.
Yeah, and she was really unhappy about it.
Yeah.
There's this really sad quote from her,
Oh,
where she says to Shengbo, "Even birds and beasts do not abandon their mates. What will you do?"
wow.
So she's basically like begging him to be loyal and compassionate,
Yeah.
reminding him that even animals show more loyalty than he is.
And did it work?
No. Sadly, he didn't listen.
Oh, no.
He forced her into the marriage.
Wow.
And the tragedy doesn't even end there. After her second husband died,
Okay.
her first husband, he wanted to prove that he was loyal to the new rulers in Jian.
Mm-hmm.
And so he did something horrible.
Oh, no. What did he do?
He drowned her two sons.
Oh, my gosh. That's awful. What happened to Shengbo's sister after that?
You know what's amazing is that even after all of that,
Yeah.
she still showed incredible strength.
Mm.
She refused to go back to her first husband. She said that she couldn't live with a man who couldn't protect his own wife
Yeah.
or raise his children with compassion.
That's a really powerful act of defiance, especially in a society where women didn't have a lot of control.
It really is. It shows how resilient people can be
Yeah.
and that desire for autonomy, even when things are really tough.
So we've really explored divorce in ancient China from all these different angles.
Yeah, we have.
You know, the political stuff in the spring and autumn period,
Mhm.
the social pressures and economic realities of the Ming and Qing dynasties,
Yeah.
and the stories of the people who lived through these times.
It's fascinating to see how things changed from that early pragmatism,
Right.
where marriage was just a tool,
Yeah.
to the later periods where it was all about keeping up appearances.
Right. And even through all of that, we can still see these glimmers of hope.
Yeah.
Of people like Lady Cai and Shengbo's sister making their own choices,
Absolutely.
even if their choices were limited.
Yeah, it really makes you think about how much things have actually changed.
Yeah.
Are we really free to decide who to marry and whether to get divorced?
Right.
Or are we still influenced by social pressures, money, gender roles?
It's a really good question.
Yeah.
And a good place to end our deep dive today.
Yeah.
It's something for all of us to think about.
Yeah. I hope everyone enjoyed this look into ancient Chinese history.
Yeah, thanks for joining us.